Story, Blade Ultimatum. Eric Blade Brooks felt selfish as he lay near the sleeping woman. The reason was that the time he spent trying to be human meant another vampire killed an innocent person and he was not there to prevent it. That guilt had weighed on him for weeks. He turned sidelong to the woman. Should he tell her what he was feeling? The thought didn't even sound right to him. More than that, she may think that he was leaving her again. Blade gently removed Jacqueline Spitfire Crichton's arm that rested lazily on his chest and he slipped out the bed. He watched her profile in the sheets. She was slender, with light brown hair and apparently in her mid-30s. In reality she was over 60, the vampire aspect of her had slowed down the aging. Blade had the same blessing in that he was 100 years old, but didn't look a day over 35. He had an athletic build and tattoos at the back of his head and arms. He left the bedroom and in 20 minutes he was dressed in a black t-shirt, body armor vest, leather combat trouser and boots. He was prepared for another long day at the Mi-13 military facility. Lastly he sat at a table, strapped his arm and bit down on a belt. Then he inserted a serum into his arm and it abated his thirst for consuming blood. Blade winced and his body shook as the silver and garlic potion worked through his system. He bit down harder on the belt as the experience prolonged. Then it gradually stopped. He took the straps from his arm and placed the miniature serum syringe in the lining of his black trench coat. He looked at Spitfire again. She had control over her vampirism, so she didn't have the thirst for blood. Ordinarily vampires needed the blood because their bodies stopped producing the blood cells in large quantities. His thoughts returned to the situation of staying in London with the Mi-13 team and his teammate Spitfire. There was no doubt that he was needed on the paranormal strike force for the big cases, like the one they were presently on. Petra, Blade muttered as he walked into the living room and headed for the window. The woman he spoke of was a new kind of vampire and she was one of several. From the questionings it was determined that the rest formed a hidden colony. The case had a deeper meaning for Blade in that Petra and the others like her shared his DNA along with Dracula the vampire lord. The revelation led Blade back to Nicholas Fury, the director of SHIELD. Since it was under that organization that a project called Silver Eye was started for combining Blade's and Dracula's DNA to form a super life form. Blade was staring out the window blinds while reflecting on his investigation with Fury. We thought that the program was shut down, but someone copied the files and the doctor behind it disappeared, Blade said to himself. Which leaves us with finding out the clues from Petra. Blade gave a slight disappointed expression. For Petra, despite having a 20-year-old appearance, was actually a child. The psychologist brought in to examine her said that the vampire had the psyche of a 5 or 6-year-old. Blade blew out some air as he thought about the information. Here's a vampire immune to sunlight, garlic, and silver and with the ability to manipulate the weather elements, and she's only a child. A child that craves human blood. Blade paused as he took in the dawning London city. The apartment had a view of the colossal Canary Wharf Tower and the solemn St. Paul's Cathedral. A double-decked bus passed on the street below. He continued his thoughts. Too bad Professor X is unavailable to telepathically probe Petra's mind. And I have to get more nanny ties from T'Challa and Ororo. He considered the Wakanda leaders as his friends and he had only met Professor Charles Xavier recently. They all had played a part in the apprehension of Petra. Blade moved from the window and he surveyed the living room. On one table were pictures of Spitfire, her deceased son, a Mi-13 group photo and him. A large frame picture hung nearby on the wall and that one showed Spitfire as a Special Forces soldier during World War II. Blade liked her warrior spirit and steely character. However, he had driven a stake through her heart when they first met, because she was another vampire to him at the time. He was a cold and indifferent person then. Years of killing and hunting vampires had hardened him until he was practically a silent and stoic person. Spitfire was trying to open him up. "It's like she's doing a behavioral experiment on me," he thought. She had once told him that he was becoming like the monsters he hunted. That nothing else would not matter to him except the next kill. But what does she expect? Those monsters play by their own rules and destroy anything in their way. "I have to push the boundaries as they do," he said. There was movement outside the apartment door. The lights were off in the living room, and Blade was using his night vision ability. Hence, his hypervision noticed the break in the light that was at the bottom of the door. The light that had been coming from outside. Then Blade sensed its presence, a half-vampire like himself outside of the door. A kindred spirit. But was it a friend or a foe? The door was kicked in and it fell off the hinges. A tall and solidly built man stood in the door frame. He wore a black trench coat and body armor. The eyes were on fire. Short black hair lay on his head. And in his hand was an automatic handgun. The barrel pointed at Blade. Hypnotically, the weapon began to sing a death song. Blade dove onto the ground to avoid the spray of bullets. His handgun and samurai sword were in the bedroom. There was no chance of getting them in time. So he had to get the shooter. Distract him, thought Blade. Next to the daywalker was a lamp table. He seized the item and threw it at the shooter. Simultaneously, Blade rushed off the floor with his preternatural speed and headed for the shooter. The lamp table did the trick of taking the attacker's focus off of Blade for a fraction of a moment. As the gun fired into the table, Blade had reached the shooter. The daywalker's hand jammed down on the gun. The bullet spray tearing up the carpet and causing eruptions of fibers into the air. Then Blade's elbow rammed into the assailant's lower jaw. The shooter countered with a sharp knee to Blade's abdomen. Then he landed a karate chop into the side of Blade's neck. Yet Blade's mind was on removing the gun from the battle. For that he had to break the opponent's wrist. Thus Blade was swiveling on his heel until he was alongside the man, and then the daywalker was gripping and twisting the shooter's wrist. Snap! Then a cry of pain from the attacker and the gun fell. The attacker shot his left foot quickly into Blade's knees. Then he headbutted the daywalker. All the while, he slipped a knife from his coat and stabbed expertly between Blade's third and fourth ribs. Blade was stalled slightly enough for the assailant to snap back his wrist in place. Then the opponents eyed each other like clashing tigers. "Who are you?" asked Blade. "Rapier," he replied with a European accent. Blade studied that the commotion would have awakened Spitfire. She'll be joining the fight soon, and he must have already known that she was here. Is he really that foolish to take on both of us at the same time, wondered Blade. Then again, he might have thought catching us off guard would be advantageous. He felt the knife wound healing rapidly, and he slowly geared into an attacking posture. "What's this about?" asked Blade, since he was not familiar with the assailant. "Me killing you," stated Rapier acidly. As he spoke, Blade saw the man's pointed fangs. Most likely he was born a half-human, half-vampire like Blade. But there was no time to dwell on the assumption. Spitfire, in an oversized sweater, was at the edge of the room behind Rapier. It would not be long until she was in the fray. Blade saw her, and he guessed Rapier also sensed it. "Explain yourself," said Blade. "You're going to die by my hands." "That's all you need to know," said Rapier, and he grinned devilishly. Suddenly Spitfire disappeared from Blade's sight. The type of vampirism she had allowed her a running speed that even Blade had trouble tracking. Then Blade noticed that Rapier was kicking backwards. The attacker caught Spitfire in her stomach, and she fell back hard against the wall. causing the hanging picture frame to fall. Blade sprang from his position with a flying kick, his right boot striking the target in the chest. Rapier recoiled as the Daywalker landed in front of him. In raw fury, Blade delivered a series high and low kicks at Rapier's torso. The assailant was equal to each thrust of the foot and he matched them with quick blocks. Unknowingly he was being edged to the window. Then Rapier saw an opportunity to strike with his knife. He parried a kick and went straight for Blade's heart. The adamantium knife would cut through the armor with ease. Yet Blade caught the danger and held Rapier's arm. Still the assassin adjusted and he dropped the knife into his free hand. As the angle for the heart penetration was gone, Rapier aimed for the throat. As the metal pierced his neck, Blade pushed forward, locking Rapier's head and then turning it sharply until he heard the cracking of the spine. In an animalistic death grip, Rapier held onto Blade and spun both of them through the window. Blade snatched the edge of the window while Rapier fell to the street. The assailant fixed his head and then he ran off. The Daywalker heard Spitfire's voice. She was at the windowsill and telling him to hang on. He felt the blade of the knife that had gone completely through his neck. With Spitfire's assistance he returned to the apartment, and he removed the knife. Then the strangest thing occurred. The phone began ringing non-stop. Spitfire ignored it as she tended to Blade. Then the voice machine came on and an excited male voice blared through the phone. It was Pete Wisdom, the head of MI-13. Spitfire, Blade, we have a breakthrough with Petra. You need to come down here immediately. 1 week later Chapter Ororo performed a spinning dive from 25,000 feet in the air. Her white hair flowing freely on the winds and her arms were held out. Below her was an alien landscape that was finally at peace after decades of war. A conflict she had once been part of. Mimicking Ororo's maneuver was Seajaim. He was a large dragon-like creature with a canine face. Ororo felt her friend's presence. Trying to keep up, asked Ororo. Very soon I'll be too old for this, remarked Seajaim in a husky voice. Then savor the moment, said Ororo while twirling downwards. She thought about her age, which was 30, and how old Seajaim must have been when she met him in her youth. Watching on at Ororo and Seajaim were T'Challa and Myron. The observers stood on the deck of the royal flying ship. I still can't thank you enough for giving me a chance to see her again, said Myron. She speaks highly of you, said T'Challa. He glanced at the queen. She was old, yet the grey eyes said there was more life inside of her. Green robes covered her body and a jeweled crown rested on her head. It's a shame that these are the last hours of your visit, commented Myron. We'll be back, hopefully, said T'Challa. He was a 35-year-old man. His body was at human physical peak coupled with hypersenses. He was dressed in causal Wakandan attire, yet he carried his sword. The 2 gold seals on the hilt were actually time-space computers. The blade was made from dark force energy, which was sheathed by nano-robots. T'Challa studied the aged warrior queen again. She walked slowly and carefully everywhere she went. But Ororo had told him that Myron had been an energetic soul, leading her troops against an adversary that was her own flesh and blood. Ororo is truly an extraordinary woman. I knew it from the moment we met, said Myron. Indeed she is, confirmed T'Challa. He remembered that it was over dinner that Myron had retold her first encounter with Ororo. There was a dimensional intersection, which Myron fell through in a pond, and Ororo saved her from drowning. Ororo was then transported to Myron's dimension. The dinner had also provided Ororo an opportunity to tell her full story to Myron. The Wind Rider highlighted that she came from a centuries-old line of Kenyan women who manipulated the weather. In the modern age she was considered a mutant and an outcast of society. Her deceased father was an African American from New York. Myron had even inquired on how Ororo met T'Challa. "We met as teenagers and kept in touch as adults, even spending time together," answered Ororo. "I even had to join in stopping him from going to war with another nation." Then Myron heard T'Challa's story. That he was the descendant of warrior kings. And he had gone from using his skills in protecting solely his nation to defending the entire earth. Although the suspicions his isolated nation garnered from the world had never dissipated despite his endeavors. And so, he like his nation had never been fully understood, trusted, or accepted. T'Challa's kimoyo began ringing. He slipped the palm-held supercomputer from his coat pocket and read the message. There was a major alert. He looked towards where he had last seen his wife, and as expected she was heading for the ship since she too had received the alert. "What is it?" inquired Myron. "A national emergency," replied T'Challa. "As always," commented Myron. A moment later, Ororo was gliding on wind currents onto the open deck. Seajaim labored behind her. "I understand that you must go now," said Myron. "It's like the last time." "Unfortunately it is so," said Ororo as she embraced the queen. "Well, I won't keep you any longer," said Myron as she released the woman she considered a daughter. T'Challa also said farewell and he joined Ororo. Then the sword teleported them from that dimension to Earth. Chapter T'Challa and Ororo kissed inside their office at the defense base. They then broke it off to dress in their combat suits. "I thoroughly enjoyed that surprise getaway," said Ororo. "Glad you did. How did you reach Myron?" "Through the sword." Ororo remembered sensing shifts in the geomagnetic pulses from time to time at their home. "I knew you were up to something," she remarked. "Really, I should start covering my cover tracks more better." "Still wouldn't help you," said Ororo as she rested her chin on his shoulder. "You may be able to mask your mind from telepaths, but I'll still always know what's going on in there." T'Challa held her gently around the waist. "Well, I got one secret right now." "What is it?" "It's where we are going on the next trip." "You mean the trip after the one I'll be planning?" "Okay. So where are we going?" T'Challa smiled because of the news. "That's a secret," Ororo replied, and her enchanting blue eyes began glowing. The couple kissed passionately. In between, T'Challa whispered, "I wonder how Umba is doing at your aunt's house." "I'm sure my aunt and her nephew are getting along fine, but I'll give them a call," whispered Ororo. "And I think we shouldn't keep Blade waiting too long." T'Challa agreed, and he finally pulled his mask over his face. The rest of the body was covered in a black vibranium weave suit. Then he magnetized the sword to his back. Meanwhile, Ororo straightened the shoulder strap on her gold and black suit. The couple had spent a minute in the office to change after they returned from Myron's dimension. T'Challa's sister Shuri had called them on the request of Blade. The Daywalker had expressed that it was a severely urgent matter. The couple had a lot of deep respect for Blade as a person and for what he did. Therefore, they were not bothered by the call. Eventually they exited the office and headed for the Situation Room where Blade was waiting. The couple had given him use of the Secret Service's satellites. They found him viewing satellite images of a flat hovering vessel within the borders of the country Transia. The vessel was circular and gigantic. There was no specific name given to the vessel, yet this was the place Blade was heading for. Chapter Blade wore shades that protected him from the vampires that went for the eyes with their long nails when attacked. The scabbard for his samurai sword ran along his back and was covered with the trench coat, except for the hilt that came out an opening. Twin automatic handguns were on his belt, as well as silver stakes, specialized boomerangs, and small weapons. He stated his case clearly to the Black Panther and Storm. We got Petra to identify the environment of the vampire colony. She gave us some structures. MI13 ran a trace and this came up. And so did a warning from the British Prime Minister office. Apparently, the vessel is off limits to the British government and her agencies because of an oil deal that was struck with Transia. They were too happy to get the deal that they didn't think it would have mattered in the future. So MI13 can't touch it, commented Ororo. Correct, said Blade. So they let me go. The guy in charge never officially reinstated me into the team, hence I'm free to do what I want. And I'm going in there. He pointed to the screen. But I'll be needing you too and those nanny ties. T'Challa held his chin. Transia. That's the High Evolutionary's country. Yes, and he built the vessel. He's been a financial benefactor to the country for years, said Ororo. No wonder they want to protect him. And he may be behind Petra and the colony, suggested Blade. Then let's go, said T'Challa. Spain, Maxoff was the head of the largest vampire clan in the world. His influence spanned major businesses and governments. His hirelings were mostly humans who wanted the privileges and status of the vampire world. These humans were called familiars and were branded with the seal of their vampire masters. Through his familiars in the British intelligence service he learned of Petra and the vessel in Transia. More importantly, he understood that Blade was interested in those areas. Yet, Maxoff's curiosity on finding out the source of the new kind of vampires far outweighed his desire to see Blade dead, at that point in time. Thus, he took 5 of his bodyguards in a limousine and headed to Rapier's home. Rapier was a product of Maxoff's ingenuity. What better way to kill a half-breed vampire than with another half-breed, the vampire leader said to himself. Therefore, he turned a pregnant female familiar into a vampire minutes before she gave birth to a son. Just as in the case of Blade's well-documented birth. The child was taken from the mother, trained and tutored, and his behavior modified for the purpose of working for the vampire clan and killing Blade. As expected, Maxoff was furious that Rapier had botched the first attempt on Blade's life. He ordered Rapier to stay at home as a means of punishment. For the man enjoyed roaming the earth on his free time. The limousine stopped outside of a villa. Maxoff and his bodyguards alighted and entered the house. The interior was like a gymnasium and quiet. The visitors met Rapier training on the parallel bars. As Maxoff watched Rapier perform the final routine, he remembered the reason for giving the child that name. It was because of the swiftness and power that the half-breed possessed. Rapier, said Maxoff. At once, the man dismounted from the parallel bars. He looked at his master with resentment in his eyes. Maxoff saw the insolence, but brushed it aside. He had more important things to discuss. He withdrew a mini-computer from his business jacket and threw it underhanded to Rapier. On it is a floating vessel above Transia. You're to go into it, find out what's going on and bring back something of worth, said Maxoff with an aristocratic flair. What about Blade? When will I get to kill him? Asked Rapier as he caught the device. Blade will be on the vessel, but you are not to fight him until you bring me the information. Is that clear? Rapier clenched his fists and tightened his jaw. The punishment and the disrespect from Maxoff irritated him. He couldn't even kill the master because it was programmed out of his mind to do so. It's clear, he said reluctantly. Good. You leave immediately, said Maxoff. A support team will be on standby during the mission to assist you. Several minutes later, Maxoff departed and Rapier prepared for the trip. He still hadn't made up his mind if he was going to either follow orders or kill Blade on the vessel. I'll see what happens, he said inwardly. His weapons were similar to blades and he knew most of the vampire's hunter's combat moves and habits. Taking Blade's life would be the payoff after years of hard training and discipline. He had been angry with himself for wasting the first opportunity. At the time he had the element of surprise along with his youth. Now Blade knew he was lurking in the shadows. Nonetheless, it makes things more interesting, he thought as he sheathed his adamantium samurai sword. An hour later, he was on a private jet bound for Transia. Chapter Culturally, Transia didn't cater to nightlife activities such as dance clubs and night bars. Hence by 10 p.m. most of the citizens were indoors with their families, sleeping, listening to classic songs or on the internet. At 10:15 p.m. Ororo enshrouded the floating vessel with a thick cloud band. Thereafter she along with T'Challa and Blade glided on the wind currents towards the first quadrant of the vessel. Nonetheless, they were spotted and their faces scanned by the vessel. It was predetermined that Ororo would create a breach in the hull with her plasma energy manipulation. However, as she was about to conduct the action, a section of the hull opened invitingly. "They know we are here," said T'Challa. "It's probably the High Evolutionary," suggested Blade. Ororo scanned the breach for bioelectricity and there were none. "It's clear and the pressure is stable," she said and ventured in first. Inside was a metal chamber. Blade detected the vampires but they were far off. Suddenly the hull resealed itself in an apparent trap. T'Challa was thinking of the three splitting up when a hologram of a robot appeared. It had a soft purple hue with minor feminine facial features, the body was slender and was 5 feet 8 inches tall. She faced Blade. "Greetings Blade and company, I'm Tekka," she said in a warm voice. "Welcome to T Colony." The vampire hunter was silent and stared hatefully at the hologram. "The vampires, where are they?" He lifted a gun from the holster. Tekka watched his action keenly. "There is no need to be concerned about the vampires. They are perfectly harmless." "Is that what you'll say about Petra?" asked Ororo. Tekka turned to the woman. "You know of her? She killed a number of people until we caught her. She complained that she was forced out of the colony," stated T'Challa. Tekka raised her hand to her chin and considered. "Well, I'm sorry for the lost in lives. I accept the blame." "Why?" inquired Blade. "Because it was I who made her leave the colony. She was troublesome and inciting violence within the community. That would draw attention." "From who?" asked Blade. "The High Evolutionary," replied Tekka quickly. T'Challa walked further into the chamber. "Is he here?" "No," replied Tekka. "But if there is major trouble in the community then I'll have to alert him and I don't want that." Tekka's voice gave the impression of fear. Blade walked by her and he went further in than T'Challa. The Daywalker had no sympathy for these vampires. They were too dangerous despite Tekka's claims to the contrary. "Wait," pleaded the hologram. "They are innocent of whatever crimes Petra committed." "They are vampires," muttered Blade as he armed the gun. "They are children," insisted Tekka. "Let me show you." The hologram's revelation aroused curiosity in the hunting party. The three warriors shared quick glances and in a telepathic-like manner agreed to hold off the charge into the colony until they saw Tekka's information. "All right," said Blade as he focused on Tekka. "Show us and it better be good." Tekka led the team to the control room for the vessel. There were multiple 7-feet-high video screens, which showed human-like creatures playing simple ball games or strolling with their offspring. There were lots of laughter and joy on their faces. The creatures were in spacious and interconnected rooms that were designed for various activities. And indeed the vampires acted like children even though most of them were young adults. It was almost Eden-like. As you can see, they don't have mature brain functions. It was a safeguard that the High Evolutionary placed in the experiment. The assertion reminded Blade of Petra's juvenile behavior and manner of speech. On the other hand, T'Challa scanned the room that was highly technological. The levels of sophistication made him think of the techno-jungle in Wakanda. Then he pondered on Tekka's tone of voice when she alluded to not wanting the High Evolutionary alerted. And why did he create these vampires in the first place, he wondered. Meanwhile Ororo studied Tekka. She must be an artificial intelligence computer in charge of monitoring the colony, the Wind Rider thought. What about blood consumption? Asked Ororo. Tekka pointed at a screen on the left. A new image appeared that showed transparent cylinders storing blood. They were in a factory setting and long tubes transported the substance like veins from the cylinders into vats. Cloned human blood is manufactured here and distributed throughout the community, answered Tekka. No humans are involved in the process. As you can see, the community is harmless. The gaiety of the vampires had no effect on Blade. He was even more concerned about the toddlers he saw on the screens. He pointed it out to Tekka and asked, "Are they born here?" "Yes. These vampires create others like them through procreation and not the typical bite as the other species does." "I'll give you all a tour of the nursery," responded Tekka. The nursery was like a hospital maternity ward. There were rows of baby cribs on the tiled floor. All the infants were asleep. The parents were elsewhere as Tekka saw to the needs of the babies. There was an atmosphere of safety. Tekka hoped that the scene would stir compassion in the hunters so she wouldn't have to fight them, which would mean contacting the High Evolutionary. She became solid and took an infant from a crib and rested the child in Blade's arms. Then she looked at T'Challa and Ororo, who were 2 rows away studying the infants. It was evident to Blade that Tekka was trying to soften him up. He watched the baby without saying a word or showing emotion. He heard the child's heartbeats and steady breathing. Slowly he recollected on Spitfire's warning that he was losing his humanity. He looked at the sleeping child intently. He would have to kill it along with the rest of the colony. If that is what it came to? Even if he did not want the situation to reach that far. The best thing is to speak with the High Evolutionary, he thought. Meanwhile, T'Challa wondered what Ororo's thoughts were on the matter. Could they allow sentimentality to get in the way of preventing another Petra from escaping the colony? And if all 3 of them had differing views, how was that to be handled? Ororo was pondering the same things as her husband. No matter how innocent the colony appears, action is required, thought Ororo. And if the High Evolutionary does nothing, then we will have to. The Wind Rider shifted her focus from the babies to Tekka. "Call the High Evolutionary," demanded Ororo. The hologram hesitated. "I mustn't." "Why?" asked T'Challa as he folded his arms. "This is the 3rd colony that he created. The previous 2 were destroyed because he saw imperfections in them," replied Tekka. Her tone of voice indicated that she had grown concerned for the colony. It was as close to as a machine could come to love. "Still, we need to speak with him," said Ororo. "No, I will not do it," stated Tekka. Her warm voice turned serious. Blade carefully returned the infant to the crib. "Look, your concern has already inadvertently caused numerous deaths in the outside world. Bring the High Evolutionary here and we'll deal with him." No, Tekka was adamant. "Don't be stubborn," said T'Challa as he moved closer to her. Blade and Storm were also approaching the hologram. They were hemming her in. Suddenly Tekka held out her arms and said, "Stop. Some else is approaching the vessel." Tekka brought up a white hologram screen from her opened right palm while she briskly exited the nursery. The hunting party following her. On the screen was a rocketeer who was speeding into the vessel. His jetpack had 2 wings with rockets attached to them, each producing a short tongue of fire. The person was traveling too fast for Tekka to identify him. Before she knew it, the Rocketeer had fired an acid grenade at the hull. Within moments there was a breach. "I can deal with him," said Tekka confidently. The Rocketeer entered the vessel and turned off the jetpack. Blade recognized the face. "Rapier," he said. "You know him," said T'Challa. "He tried to kill me last week," stated Blade. "He's a half-breed like me." Tekka ignored the conversation and concentrated on sealing off Rapier. She was like the conductor of a symphony. The sliding metal doors were closed around Rapier and a sheet of metal closed the breach. Then Tekka administered the knockout gas from the ceiling. "There," she said happily. "Really, then what's that?" pointed out Ororo. A gas mask slipped onto Rapier's mouth from his suit. He removed 2 objects from his belt and then the security camera feed went dead. "Where is that place?" "I'll go deal with him," said Blade sharply. "It's not a problem." "A little technical glitch," assured Tekka. Yet she was aware that Rapier was on the move. He had somehow escaped her trap and was in a sector that contained families. "Where is he, Tekka?" asked T'Challa. "In subsection B. But I have it under control," she replied. Still, the security feeds were unresponsive, although the motion detectors were still active. She closed more doors around the area she believed Rapier was in. Soon she sensed an explosion and another breach in the hull. Then the security feed returned. Lying in a hallway was a female vampire. There was a gash to her forehead that was healing. Tekka recognized her and the fact the toddler son was missing. The hologram scanned the new breach that was near the downed mother. Rapier was not there. Worried now, Tekka searched the area outside of the vessel and she spotted Rapier flying away with the child. Blade cursed. "Let us out the nearest exit," he said. As Tekka was about to answer, vampires that heard the commotion had rushed to the mother's assistance. Words were passed between the mother and the helpers. The stolen child caused an immediate outrage. The helpers began howling and shouting angry phrases. And telepathically they informed the entire colony of the theft. "Oh no," murmured Tekka. She then sealed the new breach. "Tekka, we don't have much time." "Let us out," said T'Challa. Meanwhile, the enraged adult vampires began transforming from their human forms into grey humanoid bats, horrible ugly creatures with elongated fangs, gleaming silver eyes and strong bulky bodies. Blood-curdling noises came from their mouths. They then started firing lightning bolts from their hands at the hull. "They'll break open the vessel," stated Ororo. "We can't allow that to happen," she thought. "T'Challa and Blade go after Rapier. I'll stay to contend with the vampires," she said. With that, Tekka dispatched T'Challa and Blade through an exit and Ororo headed for the main area to face the raging vampire horde. Chapter Ororo understood that the vampires shared her mutant powers. They must have got it from Dracula's DNA, she thought. Meanwhile, she glided on the air currents through the chain of hallways. There were 200 adults in the main area. All of them were attacking the walls, trying to break out the prison. The electrical surges from the vampires caused outages throughout the vessel. Soon Ororo encountered a batch of the vampires. She had nanitize syringes in her belt that would quell the vampires' powers, but it was not enough for the multitude that she faced. "I can't waste time with spot battles. I have to end this quickly once and for all," she thought. She then inhaled deeply and concentrated. Slowly she began peeling away her inhibitions. They were like mental blocks that kept her dark nature at bay. The glow of her eyes intensified. Then the Wind Rider felt less conscious of her physical self. As she was fusing with the natural energies of the earth. She screamed out. Then it happened. Ororo transformed from a human into a higher life form that transcended flesh, blood, and bone. At that juncture, the vampires had combined their collective energies for a final push to freedom. Both Ororo's and vampires' powers were released at the same time. The two unleashed furies clashed. A second later, the vessel experienced a massive energy surge that knocked Tekka offline. The interior of the vessel went hauntingly silent and fell into utter darkness. Soon there were the noises of a damaged creature. Yellow sparks erupted from electronic consoles, the blood factory had ruptured tubes that were spewing the red contents, fires broke out from fried circuitry, and the weakened engines that kept the vessel afloat began wailing in agony like sirens. 10 minutes flew by on the vessel and the conditions worsened. In the control room was smoky and multiple small fires crackled. One of the functioning monitors was transmitting a signal to parts unknown. It was an automatic protocol for the instant the vessel was crippled. There was stutter from the main computer terminal and white bands flickered on the screen. Then an explosion of green binary code came on the screen and they started running in sequence, making a chattering sound. The process was like a person slowly coming back to life from death. Tekka eventually revived. Like a living person, she checked the vessel like it was her body for injuries. She noticed the alert that had been sent out, but the situation was out her hands now. Thus she concentrated on repairing the damage to the vessel. Incidentally, Ororo was discovered unconscious and in a human form lying in a hallway. The vampires were also unconscious. The Wind Rider was brought to the control room by maintenance robots. Thereafter Tekka felt her power waning. Thus she went into hibernation. Chapter: The Wakanda jet had collected the Black Panther and Blade when the two had dived out of the vessel. T'Challa contacted his secret service on the whereabouts of Rapier, and he was informed that the man had entered a jet plane and was already out of Transia airspace. "Then punch this thing, T'Challa," said Blade. "Already on it," stated T'Challa as he increased the jet's speed to maximum. His only worry was that of Ororo. "Hope she's all right," he said in his thoughts. Meanwhile, Rapier struggled with the 4-year-old vampire boy even though the kid had a high dosage of nanities in him. The child bit him on the forearm. And Rapier was forced to give the rascal another injection of the nanities. Eventually the child fell into a sleep. Rapier leaned back in his seat and breathed a sigh of relief. 6 vampire helpers were also passengers on the plane and were seated in front of him. He then looked at the tools he had used on the daring mission. The portable electromagnetic pulse was very handy, his samurai sword still carried the mother's blood on it, and the acid grenade launcher had one more offering left in the chamber. "It's a pity I didn't run into Blade," he muttered. The phone rang on one of the helpers. The person answered it and said while looking at Rapier, "He's here." Then the helper journeyed to the half-breed and handed him the phone. Maxoff's stern voice was on the other end of the call. "Well," he said. Rapier lightly scratched the side of his forehead. "The vessel was a hive of these vampires. I was able to snatch a kid." "Did you see Blade?" "Unfortunately no. I'll meet you at the airfield." There was a click as the line went dead. Chapter: Blade recounted the incident with Rapier to T'Challa. No sooner had he finished than they were over the airfield where Rapier's jet had landed. 5 black Hummer vehicles were on the tarmac by the plane. "We'll jump out over them," said T'Challa while turning on the autopilot. He then activated the door on the cabin floor. It slid to the side. Blade positioned himself at the opening and waited on T'Challa's signal. The plane made a low descent like a hawk swooping down at its prey. "Now," said T'Challa as he rose from the pilot's seat. Blade nodded in agreement and he leapt out. He saw Rapier handing the child over to the vampire leader who he recognized. Directly below him were the 6 hirelings from the jet. He landed on one of the hirelings, crushing the vampire's spine in the process. The others were too slow to react to the low-flying jet and Blade's sudden appearance. He heard one whisper, "Daywalker." At such a close range, Blade opted for his handgun and it rang it out its tune. Subsequent to that, the 5 bodies erupted in fire as the silver bullets ripped through them. An amused Rapier watched on. "Well, we get to go at it again," he said. Blade had no time to waste with the smug half-breed. He raised the gun at Rapier and fired. But the upstart was quickly dashing to his left out of the bullet's reach. Meanwhile, Maxoff and his bodyguards were escaping in the 4 other Hummers. Blade drew his second firearm and began blazing the weapons at the last escaping Hummer. Eventually the vehicle rolled to a stop. Blade was still squeezing the trigger when he realized that the ammunition had finished. He heard the crack of the Wakanda's jet engines as the plane flew low over the airfield. Then he saw the Black Panther leaping onto one of the fleeing vehicles. Most likely he spotted the handover of the child, thought Blade. There was movement to the side of him. Instinctively he stepped out the attack's range just as the end of a samurai sword passed under his jaw. Rapier's wicked eyes were gleaming and his vampire nature was brought out on his face. He looked ghoulish. Blade drew his sword and held it downward, inviting the opponent to attack. "It all makes sense now," he said. "What does?" asked Rapier as he spun the sword in his hand. "You're just another lackey. They probably turned your mother while giving birth and trained you for this," Blade said with a mocking smirk on his face. "Now here you are. Heartbeats away from killing me. Something you're trained your whole life to do. Or so you would like to think." "You're pretty observant," retorted Rapier. The sword stopped spinning and the warrior charged into his nemesis. Chapter Blade blocked the incoming attack and then swiftly shot out his left boot into Rapier's knee. The young half-breed lost his stance and drifted away. "What are you afraid? You've been waiting for this your whole life, come on," shouted Blade, trying to unnerve his opponent. Furthermore, he wanted the fight ended quickly so he could join the pursuit of the child. He felt for a mini-explosive in his coat and slipped it into his hands. Rapier kept his cool and returned with another offensive. He copied Blade's sword and feet combination. But the Daywalker was onto another fighting style. He pushed down Rapier's sword and spun past him. All the while, he planted the explosive on the back of Rapier's neck. The soon-to-be dead man felt the needling device and knew what it was. He slipped the knife from his belt and cut away the flesh underneath the explosive like a whittler. Victoriously, Blade stopped his spinning and he reached for the detonator, pressing it just as the explosive fell from Rapier. There was a minor explosion that Blade's sunglasses shielded his eyes from. Rapier was not so fortunate as piece of metal got caught in his eye. Still, the half-breed smiled as he had escaped certain death. "It's that all you have?" he shouted and then turned to his opponent. Suddenly Blade was thinking about how many lives Rapier may have taken in his training to be as good as him. He saw the coldness in the man's eyes that he also possessed. The Daywalker coolly returned to a fighting posture, an attacking one. "I've wasted too much time on this already," he said. He launched ferociously into Rapier, changing sword hands and angles as he forced the opponent on the back foot. Then experience set in and Blade slyly removed an anti syringe from his belt. He feigned to his right and then lurched to the left, inserting the syringe needle into Rapier's upper arm. In the process, the upstart got in a deep blow on Blade's thigh. The vampire hunter sank on his follow-through. But it was too late for Rapier. The Nanites were working on neutralizing his preternatural abilities. Hence his body slowed down. Blade got a second wind and shot up sharply, uprooting Rapier's head with the sword. "No, that's not all I got," he said, returning to Rapier's earlier insult. The fellow daywalker's body slumped to the tarmac. Then Blade's thoughts were on Ororo and how she fared against the vampires. He headed for the Hummer that was for Rapier and drove off to catch up with T'Challa. T'Challa landed hard on the roof of the Hummer and immediately he dug the claws from his gloves into the armor-plated roof. He had seen that the child was placed in the lead vehicle and he was on the last one. His plan was to destroy the Hummer he rode on and then leap onto the second and commandeer it since the second and third vehicles were in close proximity. Afterwards he would use it to chase down the lead vehicle. Thus the Black Panther went to work. He took the sword from his back, leaned over the driver's window and then he plunged the blade into the vampire. The vehicle swerved at top speed as the driver lost control. Yet T'Challa's keen sense of balance provided him with a means of escaping the impending crash. He leapt off the roof and onto the edge of the engine hood as the Hummer leaned on two wheels. Then he made a great leap onto the second vehicle. His claws found purchase at the rear of the Hummer and he was able to climb on top. In the background he heard the third Hummer tumbling over on the asphalt. With no time to waste, T'Challa cut off the roof with the sword. The vampire bodyguards looked up in amazement before they started firing their automatic weapons. The bullets bounced off the Black Panther and he went about severing the beasts. He poured into the driver's seat after dispatching the last vampire from the vehicle. Then he gunned the Hummer. On the other side of events, Maxoff saw T'Challa's actions and he ordered 3 of his bodyguards to attack the pursuer. The 3 bodyguards climbed out the windows and onto the roof the Hummer and they leapt towards T'Challa's. Such was the supernatural speed of the bodyguards that T'Challa was unable to swerve completely out the way. The vampires latched on and each one carried a laser blade. In a savage yet coordinated attack the vampires stabbed and slashed at T'Challa through the windscreen and side windows. Their weapons were piercing his body armor. "They are going to get away with the child if I don't act soon," he thought. T'Challa slammed on the brakes and the vampires tumbled off from the jerk. Then he came out of the Hummer to face the 3 vampires. The creatures were dressed in tailor-made suits and smelled of expensive cologne. Their fangs showed clearly along with their bloodshot eyes. The Black Panther removed 2 energy blade daggers from his belt with one hand. The other hand kept the sword pointed downward. But he was not inviting an attack. It was a ruse to throw the opponents off guard. So he hid the daggers behind his back. The vampires stood and began spreading out to encircle him. But he didn't give them time. He threw a dagger each at 2 of the vampires and then he went after the third one with his sword. The daggers distracted the 2 while T'Challa's cat-like speed sent him into his prey. The vampire attempted to duck and dodge the sweep of the sword, but the slanted weapon caught him. The Black Panther swiveled on his heel and slashed the impaired vampire down the middle. The other 2 having parried the daggers were descending on him. T'Challa kept his sword close and remained light on his feet. Thus he danced away from the sweep of the first weapon and parried the second one. Then in a great fury and a swinging motion he swiped off the upper torsos of the vampires. Without looking at the falling bodies, T'Challa stared at the last Hummer that was heading out of sight. Driving to catch it would be useless. But he had his jet. He began running while he typed instructions to the jet through the Kimoyo. The jet cracked as it flew overhead and in front of the Hummer. A missile shot from the plane and into the road in front of the vehicle. T'Challa watched as the Hummer swerved and then turned on its side. He increased his speed until he was sprinting like a gazelle. He saw movement from the vehicle. Someone had run out with a preternatural speed and went into the roadside brush. Eventually T'Challa arrived at the crash site. The jet was hovering close by and drowning out the nearby sounds. T'Challa looked inside and he saw 2 bodyguards and the driver badly damaged from the crash. The boy was alive and T'Challa took him out. He guessed the other occupant had run off. He contacted Blade over the Kimoyo and he hurried onto the jet, hoping that Aurora was all right. Chapter Herbert Edgar Wyndham aka Lord High Evolutionary stepped out a time-space portal and he surveyed the pitiful control room. He saw Aurora, who he knew as Storm from the X-Men. She was lying in a chair. He found it odd to see her since moments before he was having a conversation with a Celestial about mutants and the X gene. He approached her and made to touch the shoulder, when suddenly Aurora snapped awake and swiftly drew the knife from her belt, bringing the weapon above her face. The sharpened edge pointed at the High Evolutionary. Aurora was like a king cobra ready to strike. "It is about time you showed up. You have much to answer for," she said. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a thunderous voice. He was a towering human in a technological red suit that he designed using his evolved brain. His face radiated with the experience he gathered through time and space. It was his fortune after being born an Englishman who was fond of evolution in species. Aurora told him about Petra and the colony, and it pained the creator of monsters. "Then I must destroy them," he said, since his experiment in evolved vampires was to see if their bodies would generate new cures for diseases or astounding insights. But there was nothing forthcoming to celebrate about. And he had not want his experiments harming humans. He telepathically awakened Tekka and took over her controls. At the same time, Aurora's Kimoyo rang and she answered it. "I'm all right. The High Evolutionary is here," she said to her husband. "He's going to terminate the colony." Suddenly Blade's rough voice came over. "Tell him to stop. I want to speak with him." Aurora relayed the message and turned on Kimoyo's the speaker option. "What is it, Blade?" asked the evolved man. "Don't kill them," answered Blade. "That is an unexpected request," stated the High Evolutionary. "For what reason am I to permit these things to continue living?" On the jet, Blade looked at the face of the innocent sleeping child in his arms. It was no different from any other human boy. And it had no control over the circumstances of its existence, much like him. "Because I'll take over responsibility for them," he replied. "I'll use the vessel as my base of operations. What do you say? And don't forget that you owe me for creating this mess in the first place." "Are you sure you want that burden?" inquired the High Evolutionary. Blade looked at the child. "Yes." The High Evolutionary chewed over the offer. Indeed, he was at fault for stealing the DNA codes to make the vampires. He had to atone. "Then the vessel is yours once I have done the necessary repairs," he said. Aurora then hung up. Back in the jet, T'Challa and Blade discussed the decision. "So you're leaving the team permanently?" inquired the Black Panther. "Yes. Although I'll try to make myself available for the big cases." The Daywalker thought about Spitfire and he hoped that an arrangement could be made between them. Nevertheless, he was taking back the mantle that was given to him from birth. That of being the most effective slayer of vampires. "Just the bad ones," he thought.